latest industry to take a supply chain hit, and that's farming. With a global fertilizer shortage, farmers across the world are having to shift tactics to make sure they have a good crop to harvest and sell.
Trump is proposing what he calls severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizers. His idea here is apparently to support domestic production.
For years, something strange sat in plain sight across the Canadian prairies. Farmers produced world-class wheat. Alberta fields poured out canola. Saskatchewan pulled more potash from the ground than any country on the planet. Yet when it came time to sell that power to the world, Canada sent it south first. American rail lines, American ports, American companies deciding the price of access. Then in March 2025, Mark Carney stood in front of Saskatchewan farmers and said the quiet part out loud. Why were Canadians paying foreign tolls to move their own food? Why was a country this rich in agriculture still acting like it needed permission to trade? That question landed hard because the timing could not have been sharper. Donald Trump was threatening tariffs across Canadian agriculture. 25% on grain, new fees on fertilizer, pressure aimed directly at prairie livelihoods. What had felt inconvenient for decades suddenly looked dangerous. Carney did not call it a crisis. He treated it like a map problem. Canada already dominates global potash. It ranks third in wheat exports, and it owns a deep-water Arctic port that slices thousands of kilometers off the route to Europe compared to Vancouver or US terminals. The Port of Churchill had been ignored, underfunded, dismissed as a relic. Now it looked like leverage. What followed was not symbolic. It was structural. Canada began reshaping a $780 billion agricultural trade system. Fertilizer companies in Saskatchewan started rerouting supply. American logistics firms began losing control of a chain they once owned end to end. An Arctic port everyone forgot became central again. So how did this shift happen so fast? Who wins and who loses when Canada stops playing middleman games? And what does it mean when a country finally uses the power it already had? For decades, Canada's role in the global food system has been hiding in plain sight. Quietly enormous, yet rarely discussed outside farming communities and commodity markets. Across the prairies, wheat fields stretch beyond the horizon, canola fills rail cars by the thousands, and beneath Saskatchewan lies the largest concentration of potash on Earth. These are not symbolic contributions to global food security. They are foundational. Potash alone underpins modern fertilizer, and without it, crop yields around the world fall sharply. Roughly half of the global population relies on fertilizers that depend on potash inputs. Canada produces 32% of global potash supply, controls 41% of exports, and still has an estimated 1.1 billion tons in the ground. Add to that wheat exports worth about $11.5 billion a year, nearly 27.7 million tons shipped to more than 80 countries, with Canada leading the world in high-quality, high-protein wheat. Canola, barley, oats, lentils, peas and specialty crops round out a portfolio that makes Canada one of the most influential agricultural producers on the planet. In 2023, total agricultural exports exceeded $99 billion, with long-term growth projected around 3.5% annually. Yet for all that strength, the system moving these products to global markets has long told a different story. Most Western Canadian grain flows through Vancouver, a port that struggles with congestion, labor disruptions, and rising costs. Large volumes also move south, crossing into the United States before ever reaching an ocean. Fertilizer from Saskatchewan mines travels through American rail networks and ports to reach international buyers. Every step adds fees collected by American companies that do not grow crops or mine fertilizer, but profit from controlling the routes. For years, this arrangement was accepted as inefficient but unavoidable. Vancouver was the only Canadian port with year-round Pacific access and meaningful scale. Eastern routes through the St. Lawrence added weeks to transit times for prairie producers. Alternatives existed on maps, not in reality, so dependence on American infrastructure hardened into habit, and habit became assumption. That assumption began to crack when political risk entered the equation, when Donald Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian agriculture, including a proposed 25% levy on grain and new fees targeting fertilizer. The cost of dependence stopped being theoretical. These were not abstract trade disputes. Prairie livelihoods were exposed to decisions made in Washington, enforced through infrastructure Canada did not control. What had once been tolerated as an inefficiency started to look like a strategic vulnerability. The question shifted from whether Canada could move its agriculture independently to what it would take to make that possible. The answer had been sitting on the northern edge of the country for nearly a century. The port of Churchill, built in the 1930s as a gateway to Europe through Hudson Bay, was designed to shorten shipping routes by thousands of kilometers compared to paths through Vancouver or American ports. Rail-connected, deep-water capable and geographically advantaged, Churchill should have been transformative. Instead, it became a case study in neglect. Chronic underfunding limited operations to a short seasonal window. Traffic remained minimal. By the late 20th century, the port was seen less as strategic infrastructure and more as an expensive curiosity. In 1997, the federal government sold the port and its 1,300-kilometer rail line to an American company, Omnitrax, for $1. The price reflected expectations. Little investment followed. Maintenance lagged. When flooding washed out sections of the rail line in 2017, Omnitrax walked away. The port fell silent. Churchill was effectively cut off. In 2018, a consortium made up of 41 First Nations communities and northern Manitoba towns purchased the port and railway, forming the Arctic Gateway Group. At the time, the move was widely viewed as symbolic. Indigenous ownership of neglected infrastructure carried political weight, but few believed the port had a real commercial future. That skepticism lingered until the global context shifted. Rising shipping costs, persistent congestion at Vancouver, and growing uncertainty around American trade policy began to change the math. Climate change, extending the navigable season in Hudson Bay, added another variable. What had once been dismissed as impractical started to look timely. The turning point came in March 2025, when Genesis Fertilizers, a Saskatchewan-based company planning a large nitrogen fertilizer plant, announced a partnership with Arctic Gateway Group. The plan was direct. Phosphate and ammonium sulfate would be imported through Churchill. Finished fertilizer products would be exported through the same port, bypassing American infrastructure entirely. Genesis projected annual production of 1 million tons of fertilizer, requiring roughly 300,000 tons of phosphate imports. Historically, those inputs flowed through the United States. Under the new model, they would not. The route through Hudson Bay connects directly to Atlantic shipping lanes, cutting distance and cost compared to sending freight west to Vancouver and around South America, or navigating American ports and the Panama Canal. The decision was not framed as patriotic or symbolic, it was economic. Shorter routes, lower logistics costs, and insulation from political interference made Churchill competitive. Once that logic held for fertilizer, it became difficult to ignore its implications for the rest of Canadian agriculture. Saskatchewan's fertilizer industry alone is worth billions annually. If one company could restructure supply chains around Churchill, others could follow. Grain posed an even larger opportunity. Canada exports roughly 29 million tons of grain annually through Vancouver alone. Historically, Churchill handled only a fraction of that, sometimes a few 100,000 tons in a strong year. The limitation was not demand, but infrastructure. Arctic Gateway Group's strategy was not to siphon existing traffic from Vancouver overnight, but to enable trade that could not exist without northern capacity. The Port of Churchill Plus project sits at the centre of that plan. It calls for major upgrades to grain handling equipment, new storage facilities, modern loading systems, and expanded rail capacity. Icebreaker support could extend the shipping season from roughly 4 months to potentially near year-round operations. With these changes, Churchill becomes viable for consistent large-scale exports. The route to Europe through Hudson Bay cuts approximately 6 days off transit compared to Vancouver. For grain traders and buyers, time translates into money through lower logistics costs, reduced spoilage, and improved market timing. It also means shipments that remain entirely within Canadian control from farm to port. The strategic implications compound quickly. Canadian wheat and canola grown in Saskatchewan, transported on Canadian railways, exported through a Canadian Arctic port to European markets without passing through American hands. Fees that once flowed south stay at home. Control that once belonged to foreign logistics firms shifts back to producers and domestic operators. Independence stops being an abstract goal and becomes a practical outcome of geography and investment. The scale of what could move through Churchill explains the often cited $780 billion figure. This is not the total value of Canadian agriculture, nor does it assume Vancouver becomes obsolete. It reflects the projected value over a decade of trade that could logically route through Arctic infrastructure.